Everyone, and welcome back to another Strategoi video. Ryan here with part two of the State of Shooting series that I hope to be continuing well into the future. It's kind of interesting because I've been noticing more stats-oriented, statistics-oriented content regarding AOS units output over the last few weeks from the likes of Caleb Hastings, who was our guest on the Seraphon review about a month ago, I guess, maybe 3 weeks ago. And then also Stuart Iron Gutsman McGowan. He's been doing some great content on the math side of things too, so I encourage you guys to go check those channels out as well. Everyone's going to have their different approach to doing this stuff, and maybe I'll talk about the differences and the reasons why I do things my way at some other point in the future. But this video today, which is following up with our first video of the state of shooting regarding output efficiency, this time focusing on plus and minus one to hit, is going to take a while to get through. So I'm going to just try to get right to the point and jump on in. In the meantime, before I forget, guys, just don't be shy with the comments or the Discord stuff. Just be nice, keep it friendly. But I really appreciated all the feedback from last time, and it's and a lot of people have been checking out the video, so it's real nice to see that it's being well received. And so hopefully part two is equally well received. All right, let's get into it. So I'm going to do a quick review of what part one was all about, but of course, go check that video out if you haven't already. It's under an hour, so hopefully you guys have gotten used to our more podcast-oriented presentation here, so an hour shouldn't be too much of a problem, and hopefully today we'll keep it around that time, if not shorter if we can. Following the review, we'll talk about plus and minus one to hit in general, including some of the basic stats behind it, and then we'll update the base chart that we had from last time, and then we'll talk about some new entries into the kind of range of interesting output per 100 points kind of stats that we've got for different units after they get some plus one to hit. And then looking at the bottom end of the spectrum, that would be looking at particularly the original 17 with the minus one to hit from, say, Covering Fire or some other debuff somewhere else. And then summarizing everything, we'll be looking at the top 30 performing scrolls, including not only the pluses and minuses to hit, but also the base profiles from before. All right, so let's get into it. As a review of part one, what we ended up doing was talking about the nerfs and buffs to shooting since 3rd edition, just in general. So that was more of a overarching kind of bird's eye view of the whole scenario and the situation state of things. So if you were coming in from 3rd edition, haven't played a whole lot of 4th, it was kind of a catch up for that kind of stuff, and just kind of so that we're all on the same page. We also talked about efficiency. What the idea generally is, what we mean by that word is basically how much bang for the buck you get per 100 points worth of output per unit. And that's being taken at computations for saves from 6 all the way down to 2, and then just averaging them out evenly, which comes out to mostly around the same thing as a 4-up save, but not entirely. Depends on what your Rend and Mortals situation looks like. We also discussed the haves and have-nots as with regards to shooting with different armies. So some armies are particularly great at it, mostly Order and Chaos armies. And then once you get over to the Death and Destruction side, you're really not seeing a whole lot of shooting. But then again, not every Order army is as gifted with shooting as the others are, and Chaos even more so. We were also, on the first part, focusing on base profiles, meaning profiles that are just what you see is what you get. We were only looking at the War Scrolls, not using any Audit attacks or any other army buffs, and no conditional buffs that were even on the War Scroll, like anti-charge, plus one rend, or like anti-cavalry, or whatever. It had to be something that you could reliably have on that unit all the time without having to have anything else go off. So that was kind of being used as a way to see what the baseline is for the top. We ended up looking at the top 17 profiles, and this is moving on to my last point here, meaning the 17 wasn't a random number I picked. It was all of the units that managed to have a 3 damage per 100 points efficiency score against average saves as in the average of all 5 different save possibilities, 6 to 2 plus. And those, it just happened to be 17 profiles that fit that. And so by using the base profiles, what we ended up having is kind of a baseline for what we can expect from like pretty good shooting units, right? And even if you can't get an extra buff off, you're out of CP, or you're for one reason or the other, your spell doesn't go off, or whatever it is that you needed, you know that you can rely on those units to perform at least as good as what we're seeing here. So that was the whole idea. It's just a starting point. And now today we're going to be taking it one step further. So let's get into that. So I guess before I get into that, I should talk about what the chart looked like. This is what our kind of output chart looked like at the end of the last video, where we basically got down to seeing in this chart each unit, how big it is, how many points you're paying for that size, which army it belongs to, which saves, what kind of like raw output it was having on average against specific saves, and then averaging them all out for the EV average, that's expected value as in like a mean, and then per 100 points, which like let's take the Warpfire throwers, you take that 7 expected value average of the 5 different saves, you divide it by their points cost, and you multiply it by 100 to get a very usable output per 100 points. One thing that I've seen other content creators be doing is how many points you have to pay to get an expected 1 damage point out. But the thing I don't like about that is that's the inverse of the relationship, where you actually want it to be low. Like you would want the amount of points you have to pay to be as low as possible to get 1 damage. And then that number doesn't end up reflecting their total output. So even though you can see like with the Warpfire throwers, their EV average, expected value average, 7 is 2 whole points off from their per 100 points. If once I've scaled everything to per 100 points, I'm still getting a sense for how much the unit does, like how much actual damage they do. Whereas if you have it in damage per point, or like no, how many points you have to pay for 1 damage, then you have to kind of do some math in your head to even kind of get in the ballpark. But it's still a usable thing. It's just a different scale, and that's the reason I like this one. Anyway, in the rest of the chart, we saw that basically the top, like however many performers, 10 of them were Order armies, 5 were Chaos armies, mostly Skaven, but with a splash of Nurgle and Slaanesh. And then we had 1 destruction and 1 death in there. So, but mostly Order and some Chaos. And Skaven, at least, and this is as recent as the Skaven battle tome, but not updating for the Stormcast battle tome because we don't have points yet. I will update that in a probably quicker video if the chart changes meaningfully. But anyway, let's get on to plus and minus 1 to hit. So some basic concepts here. All units have access to at least 1 source of each type. That would be plus 1 to hit, all out attack. There's nothing stopping you from doing that most of the time. You just have to have a CP and, a unit that's like within range or whatever. And no one stops you from using that CP like Catacross's ability or something. Minus 1 to hit is the other way, the other side of the equation. And sure, there's tons of armies that have minus 1 to hit for whatever reason. But more importantly, everyone wants to use covering fire in the opponent's turn, and you're implicitly getting a minus 1 to hit in doing so. So both of these are attached to CP usage. Because every single unit, I'd already computed for literally every single shooting profile in the last video, and then only showed you what the top 17 profiles were, those 17 that hit a 3.0 efficiency score or higher. Now I applied the same exact reasoning to every single unit, assuming they could get plus 1 to hit. And so that gave us some new entries. I think we got 20 new entries into the 3.0 or more in efficiency score. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And then the minus 1 to hit obviously couldn't have brought any new units in because they would only get worse, and they already weren't in the list. So it's only impacting those top 17 profiles we saw before. So today we're applying both to every unit of the game, and not every unit is affected proportionally, which gets me to the next point, and was kind of a point of maybe a little bit of contention in the comments, but not really. But I just wanted to clear this up. People were wondering, like, why is it that when you add plus 1 to hit, or -1, it's not impacting units equally because it's adding +1. And one of the commenters, mathematically correctly identified that the problem is that your proportions, the amount of performance improvement that you're getting out of it is disproportionate based off of what your to hit value was to begin with. So if let's take an example here. Let's say you had a to hit value of 6, which is just an example because I don't think there's a single value of 1 or 6 up on anything in the game that's like a base. But wards, yes, but not to hit and wound rolls. So anyway, let's pretend you needed a 6 up. So in the standard version of the world, where you don't have any extra like abilities like auto wound or crit 2 hits, you are achieving this 1 out of every 6 times that you roll a die, right? Or a die has a 1 out of 6 chance of hitting a 6. Let's put it that way. When you get to +1 to hit, that doubles your chances, right? Because you have now a 2 out of 6 chance to hit, because now you need it on 5s. That's a 5 or a 6. So 2 out of 6 of the possible options that are evenly likely to happen, if your dice is fair, are going to hit. And that means you have a plus 100% improvement or double your output. That's just what that means. If you go to the other side of the spectrum, though, a 2+, you're already hitting on 5 out of 6 out of every time. Actually, this is a bad example because, as the asterisk says here, a +1 to hit would mean functionally that you'd go up to 1+, but we know that in the game that's not possible. So you actually don't get any buff. So that's a great example of not every value that you could be starting off on, like a 2+ in this case, is equivalent to the other ones. So it gets 0 improvement, but that's a technicality. Let's go to 3-up. A 3-up hits 4 out of every 6 of the times that you roll, or at least that's how many options are on a die. The 3, 4, 5, and 6 is 4 out of the 6 options. When you go to +1 and makes it 2, you now have 5 options. That is a 25% improvement over what your chances were before, or functionally equates to 1 and 0.25 times whatever your output was before. I hope that's clear, and the chart scales accordingly in the stuff in between. All right, so now let's head over to crit 2 hits. This one's a weird one because it feels less intuitive, but imagine you're rolling tons of dice, okay? On a single die roll, I will admit it does not feel like this is what happens, but I can promise you in the long run with a large amount of dice rolls, it does balance out this way. Let's take a look at a 2+, because I think that's the easiest way to explain this. And we'll just look at a 2+ without a +1 to hit. So crit 2 hits. On a 2+, of course, you're normally hitting 5 out of 6 of the dice rolls, possibilities, right? So 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 succeeds. Now imagine you roll a ton of dice, okay? We could say 60, all right? On average, you're going to roll 10 of each of the dice. It could be a little bit off, but roughly it's 10 of each of the different rolls that you could have. 10 ones, 10 twos, 10 threes, and so forth. Those 10 ones that you roll are going to, of course, not succeed. But then you're going to roll 10 sixes. And each of those sixes with crit 2 hits doubles, which means not only they count for the sixes, but they make up for the 10 ones that you failed. Sometimes you can spike and get way more than you should have, but on average, you're going to get everything through, especially as you roll more increasingly high numbers of dice. You're going to get very close to rolling everything through, if not above, or just below. That's the idea of crit 2 hits, and that applies for the other things too. So it functionally feels like you're getting +1 to hit, which is cool because it's the only way that you can kind of get up to beyond a 2+ to hit. If you have a 2+ and then you do crit 2 hits. Or let's say you have 3+ and then you do +1 to hit, and as you see in this chart, it gets you up to 6 out of 6, right? So you started with 5 out of 6. That would be 3, 4, 5, and then 6 doubles up to give you the other 2. And then when you add +1 to hit, it goes to basically being a 2-up with crit 2 hits, and then gets you there, right, to 6 out of 6. So the improvement is shifted over. If I go back to the last table, take a look at what we got with crit 2 hits, and then when we go back to the other table, you see that essentially the scores move around, where they move kind of one layer up, which is kind of interesting. So strangely, in a weird way, a +1 to hit when you already have crit 2 hits does less for your total output than if you just had a standard like die roll and you added +1 to hit. But that kind of goes to another point in the comment section before, is that technically that's true, but of course it's better to go from a base, like a standard roll with no buffs, to +1 to hit and crit 2 hits, right? To have both of them. And that, of course, is better. The other thing that's nice about crit 2 hits is that functionally it feels like you've got built-in +1 to hit without actually having to pay for a +1 to hit somewhere. So that's another reason that's better. But technically, if you're starting with no buff, you're just a regular standard roll, or you're starting with crit 2 hits, and then you pay for +1 to hit, you're actually getting less of a performance improvement when you add it to the crit 2 hit situation than a standard unit. In that sense, if two units had the exact same expected value output, like before one of them has crit 2 hits and the other one's just standard, before you add a +1 to hit, and you have to choose which one you add +1 to hit to, you might want to choose, and let's say they're both going to the same target, you might want to actually pay that CP and put it on the one that doesn't have crit 2 hits, so that they're both functionally kind of hitting on +1 to hit. It's a kind of a weird techie math thing, but that ends up actually working out in the long run, especially if they both get to strike first. That's another thing that's worth considering, but we'll talk about that some other time. Okay, so then let's look at -1 to hit. Okay, so it's kind of the inverse of what we just said. So if you start with a 6, obviously you're not allowed to get -1'd, if you will. So it doesn't actually reduce anything because 6s are always successful. But let's say you got a 5. If you're starting on a 5, you're hitting on 5s or 6s. When you get that -1 to applied, only 6s are going through, which means you went from a 2 out of 6 chance that each die succeeds to a 1 out of 6, cutting your output in half. So that's why I said -50%, or i.e. 0.5 times whatever you were supposed to do. Now, if you read down the chart here on the right-hand side for the reduction column, you'll actually see that as your starting to hit value gets better, the amount of debuff that you gets less significant. You can either read that as how much is being subtracted, which percentage of your output is being subtracted, or how much goes through. So it goes from at -50% at half of your output, all the way down to only -20%, or you get 80% of your stuff through. So starting on to hit of 2+ and getting -1 to your output doesn't actually hit you as hard for your total amount of output as it would for a unit that was starting on 4s or 5s. Okay? All right, let's get, so, yeah. Oh, and this would be the crit 2 hits version of the same thing. It basically functions the same way. If you, interestingly here, obviously, if you are at a 6 and you get -1, it still can't make you actually -1 because 6s are still successful and they're implicitly still crits, so that's still good. If you're on 2s, you go from what normally would be functionally all of your attacks going through, so 6 out of 6, to being 5 out of 6 with that, which means you have a -17% output reduction, which is pretty good if you're working on those crit 2 hits. So it impacts you pretty minimally. All right, so then moving on to some caveats. The first caveat is the effect, because I haven't talked about crit auto wounds. This depends on your to wound characteristic. I'm not going to get into it here because it gets more complicated, but my second point is, so though your hit characteristic still plays the largest role in determining the impact of a +1 or -1 to hit, how severe this is dependent on the to wound characteristic itself. So, for example, the next point, while a plus or -1 on a to hit of 5+, so if your base to hit roll needs to be a 5+, while a plus or -1 to that type of profile usually has the most impact, a 5-up, 5-up, so as in a 5-up to hit, 5-up to wound, actually is less affected by a plus or -1 to hit than a 4-up, 3-up, or a 4-up, 2-up. And this might feel counterintuitive, but we'll talk about it in another video sometime. It has to do with the auto wound doing more work because you had a bad to wound roll here, even though you got, say, a +1 to hit or a +1 to wound on that 5-up, or sorry, +1 to hit or -1 to hit on that 5-up, 5-up, because 6s skip that whole 5-up stage, because your to wound roll was so bad, it doesn't have as big of an impact as you would think. And the other two options I listed here are actually more severely impact, either in a positive or negative way, with a +1 to hit or -1 to hit. And then a final note, we'll save crit mortals for another day since none of the best performing shooting profiles have that ability anymore. It used to be the case, and then you had to go into a whole other conversation. But so that's caveat 1, all right? And then caveat 2, if a unit's attacks or damage are different, so than another unit, but they both have the same expected value, then the impact of a plus or minus 1 to hit can feel quite different for the two. So I've got two profiles here with the exact same expected value. I've ignored rend. Let's just assume rend is the same, okay? So profile 1 is 4 attacks with a 4-up save, a 4-up to hit, 4-up to wound, 1 damage. Profile 2 is 1 attack, 4-up to hit, 4-up to wound, 4 damage if it goes through. Both have the expected value pre, as in before you've accounted for the save. Let's say the target has no save, of 1 damage on average. But profile 1 with 4 attacks, but only 1 damage, has a much better chance of at least getting something out in terms of output. And profile 2 is way swingier. What do I mean? Well, you want to get one shot at getting through the whole chain on profile 2. You roll 1 die. If you fail that first 4-up, you still have to run the gauntlet and pass that next one. And then, like I said, let's say they have no save. Then you finally get to do 4 damage. But that's a 1 out of 4 chance that you get to do 4 damage, which of course averages out to 1. 4 damage, if you repeat this process enough times, 1 out of every 4 times it happens. So on average, each time does 1. But it's not going to feel like that in game. Whereas the other one, you would have to fail all 4 of them each time with a 4-up filter set of filter steps, and so most likely you will get something through. Not most likely is maybe not the best way of saying it, but way more likely than the other one. If you had to look at it as a binary on/off of whether you get any damage through, 4 attacks, 1 damage is way better than 1 attack, 4 damage, especially with this to hit and wound roll. So my last point, a +1 to hit often feels like it has way more impact on profile 2 because you're really hoping to get through those filter steps, the to hit and wound roll, and of course rend save if there's a problem, someone's got a decent save there. So you actually get those 4 damage, and then it's great. But that's what we mean by spiky or swingy. All right, so we got the math out of the way. So now we're actually going to look at some results here, right? So I wanted to talk about the base chart and talk about what we're going to be kind of like overview of what we're talking about today. So there's 5 different categories that we've got. Category 1 is that we're going to look at the units from the original 17, and then with a +1 to hit, they all got better, right? Or not all, I should say. 15 of those 17 got better. That leads me to point 2. Units from the original 17 that stayed the same despite having a +1 to hit. Well, why would they stay the same? Because they had a 2+ to hit base, and those would be our Warp Fire Throwers and Warp Volt Scourgers. Those 2 units, unfortunately, don't get better in this new way of looking at all of the units and ranking them against each other. But there's a caveat to that as well. Option 3, units that were not in the original 17 that were high enough that once they got the +1 to hit, they passed over the 3.0 output threshold per 100 points that I have established here. Granted, it's an arbitrary cutoff, but I feel like it's a decent one to kind of keep us from talking about every single shooting unit in the game. And now there might be some people that were wondering, why didn't this unit that seems to be a problem with shooting in the game in general, why didn't I see them last time on the chart? Obviously, there were some armies that weren't even represented at all in the 17 units from the first video. And that's partly because, and you might, like say Flamers in Tzeentch, you might be like, well, I see them every time I play Tzeentch, and they do pretty good work. What's the deal there? Well, they take like a 6 block, they give them all attack every single time, so that would put them into this category. Maybe there's something else that they're getting out of it, some other buff that they're always using with that 1 block of 6. And considering that Tzeentch, that's their best shooting unit, just in terms of efficiency, that's their only choice. So if you do play Tzeentch, you will see that unit, and they didn't get to choose one of the other units that has better output. But whereas in Skaven, there's like a ton of units you might see that actually do, some decent output, and that's why we saw a few of them in that first category. But there's also some that pop in now once we use the +1 to hit. So anyway, group 4 is units from the original 17 that despite having a -1 to hit are still at 3.0 or above in terms of output, which there's 5 of those I'll go and tell you, and that's pretty great. That even though they get nerfed, they're still doing output that's better than the not 17, all the units but the 17 that were in the first video. Let's put it that way. And then the last category will be units from the original 17 that when they do have a -1 to hit, fell below the 3.0 threshold, and therefore aren't really being taken into consideration anymore. So similar to how I did last time, I've kind of broken them all the profiles up into kind of their grand alliances. So now we have 37, the top 37 most efficient profiles once they get a +1. I'm not looking at base profiles here. Literally every single unit gets +1, and then we'll look at the top 37, which is the ones that cross that 3.0 threshold. Order has 22 of those, so that's +12 from what they had of their base. So they got a good bit added in there, more than double. Chaos has 9, which is +4 from their base, almost double. They had 5 before. Death has 2 units. That would be +1 from its base, so it doubled up. And Destruction has 4 units now, +3, so it quadrupled from what it had before. Not that Destruction is a particularly great shooting faction or alliance, but getting +3 units into the conversation is still nice. And then when we look at being debuffed with a -1, the top most efficient profiles, there's only 5 of them. There's 2 in order, so 8 of the 17 from order, well, the 10 from order fell out. Chaos has 3, if I'm not mistaken, that's still just Skaven. And 2 of those, the other 2 fell out, which would be Rotmire Creed and Blitzbarb Archers, if I'm not mistaken. Death has 0 units, and 1 fell out, and Destruction as well. Okay, so let's move on to the new chart of the original 17. So all we're doing here is looking at the original 17 units, but now looking at how they're ranking against themselves, against each other, changed. This doesn't mean that there aren't any new units that would pop up into the top 17. There are, in fact, 1 or 2 units that pop up, pushing a couple of the old 17 out. However, I wanted to do a pure unit for unit comparison to where they rank against themselves relative to where they used to rank. So for example, if we look at the Rattling Guns, they're our top place now. They used to be rank 2, now they're rank number 1. So they went, the delta here is what their improvement in terms of ranks against each other went, and so they went up 1 slot. But then we have their expected value average, their output per 100 points, and then what their performance improvement was by getting that +1 to hit, which most likely is coming from all-out attack. This again goes to the point that all units benefit equally from a +1 attack. If you just scan down the percent improved column, you will quickly see that that's just not true. Granted, they're all largely between 20 and like 30-ish, but there's reasons that some of these units are not getting, like that the whole chart changed. You're going to see, if you scan quickly down the delta, you'll actually see our biggest change for any unit was the Rotmire Creed. By getting a +1 attack, they went up 5 slots. Granted, that's not the biggest percentage improvement because they only went up 28.5%. Some of the units went up 33%. But the field that they were in down there, in terms of the slots they were in, was actually really tight before. And so because they were in such a tight race, going up by 28.5% pushed them up more slots than some other units in other places. For example, Fire Slayer's Auric Hearthguard, the 3rd slot there, went up by 33 and a third, so with 1/3 more efficient now, or better performance improvement, but they only went up 2 slots because the competition at the top was pretty stiff, as in like there were some really hard to move places, some guys that really had strong leads. But anyway, you could study this for yourself, but essentially I'll just go through down the list real quick. So we've got Rattling Guns followed by Namarti Reavers. Again, this is all with +1 to hit. Auric Hearthguard, Warp Fire Throwers, Arco, Venari Sentinels. Again, that's assumed that they're at 18 inches. We're using a +1 to hit, so now they're on 2s to hit. Grunstock Thunderers, the Bolt Boys with the hasty shots, Hunters of Wanchis with darts, Rotmire Creed, Vanguard Raptors with long strikes, Judicators with bows, Pyregeist from Nighthaunt, Blitzbarb Archers, Slanesh assuming no other buffs but +1 to hit, Bloodstalkers from Daughters, Gossamed Archers, Sylvaneth, and then Warfold Scourgers with Skaven. So that's an interesting point, is that unit fell the most It was in 6th place before and fell all the way down. It's partly because they're the most expensive unit on here at 190. Um, and there's just some more points efficient stuff. The other thing that hurt is, like the Warpfire throwers, it was already on a 2 plus to hit and couldn't get better. And so you'll see in the percentage improved column for both of those units, I wrote 2 plus, ignore -1. Because it didn't actually improve in a output sense, but what it did get is that if someone happens to have a -1 to hit buff, or debuff, I should say, and then they're shooting, they just, if you use all at attack, they ignore that -1 to rend, and they functionally get just to be on their regular profile, which is always a 2 plus. Of course, that's always true. If you use all at attack and someone's got a -1 to hit like debuff, then you're staying on your regular profile. It's +1, -1. But the notable thing is here is this unit, unlike a lot of other things, gets to be at the best performance possible for a hit roll, being 2 up. And in the case of the Scourgers, they're on crit 2 hits as well. So they're not only on a 2 up, but they're on functionally getting everything going through on average than that to hit step, like we talked about earlier, ignoring that -1 if they use a all attack. So kind of cool. It also means that with covering fire, because they're on a 2, they're only going to a 3, which is a great profile. But we'll talk about that later. But the reason why the Warpfire throwers stayed so good, and they went down 3 slots. They were in the top slot, is because they are cheaper. They have a shorter range. They have 5-inch shorter range. And that's something else that's worth talking about here. Rattling guns, the top performers at 15. Reavers are at 12. Orc Hearthguard, I want to say, are at 10 or 12. I can check that in a second. Warfire throwers are 10. Arco are probably also still pretty short. I got to check that one too. It's, I'm remembering the 3rd edition versions of these. Let's take a look. So Orc Hearthguard are at 12-inch. Okay, so that's generous. For, I thought it might have been down to 10. And then Arco, let's see. Arco are at, their base profile is 10, but they've got a couple weapons that are 15. You'll also notice that a lot of the percentages improved on some of these things are weird numbers. Like things like 25, 20, 33, these are normal things you would expect from a change. But then you get like Arco's got 30, 61. That's because they have a mixed unit with different profiles. They've got 2 guns that have, one's got crit 2 hits, it has more shots, another one's more elite, and then you get the rest of the guys on regular weapons, and they all have slightly different profiles. You could say also something similar about Thunderers. Some of them have auto wounds on where the to wound roll is not a 4 up, which makes it like if you have a crit auto wound on a 4 up to wound, it functions like a +1 to hit, or a -1 to hit. But if it's any other to wound value, it's going to have numbers that look more foreign to what we're used to looking at. And that's kind of why we're getting some weird mixtures here. Or Judicators with bows, for example, the way you can arm it is that because it's sacrosanct and they didn't use the same wording that they have in the rest of 3rd or 4th edition, like indexes, you can technically make the champion have the elite weapon. Whether that's the right choice or not doesn't matter. Or, well, it's a discussion for another time. But essentially, the Judicators with bows have 1 elite weapon, which is worth taking whether it's on the champ or not. And then that throws the kind of output out, the normal percentage improved into kind of weird territory with the 23-14. Anyway, I hope you guys get something out of this chart, but let's move on. So new additions via the +1 to hit. There's 20 new things. These are not particularly in an order other than I just listed the factions that have the most. So Stormcast main, as in the actual battle tome itself, added in like new units that weren't previously in the 3 up, 3.00 or more damage output per 100 points kind of threshold, were Vanguard Raptors Hurricanes, and then Vigilors, which are great because they're giving a +1 to hit on everything. So they're kind of enabling this whole conversation. And then we've got the sacrosanct units of Judicators with crossbows, not just bows now, Castigators, and the Celestar Ballista, all of which are now 3.0 or above per 100 points. And that is not taking into account the Lord Ordinator's buff to the Celestar Ballista, but I'll go and tell you right now, if you account for his points, because that's the only reason you would take him, he actually makes it less efficient. So don't. But, it looks good on paper. Skaven got the addition of Warplock Jezzails, which of course got nerfed with their battle tome. But if we had been talking about their previous um, stats, I think we would be having a different conversation. They probably would have been in the top 17 or whatever over the 3.0 threshold from the get-go. But anyway, now they are officially. Acolyte Globadiers, of course, they don't move as fast as they need to, and they've got a short range. And Night Runners, kind of similar story, but they're also good for other things, like being a prospector unit. Cities, Wildercorpse Hunters are now across that threshold. Iron Drakes and Dark Shards. It's worth pointing out again, just because a unit crosses this threshold with +1 to hit, doesn't mean they're worth giving a very precious resource away for. So if you're debating which unit's going to use your all-out attack, and you can't reinforce the unit to make it as big as possible to get the most benefit, like bang for your buck, then probably a Wildercorpse Hunter is not the unit you want to use it on. But technically, if there's some other source of +1 to hit somewhere that they can get without having to use a limited resource, then of course it's worth shooting with them with that. Cruel Boys. We've got Man-Skewered Bolt Boys again on the menu, which is a nice orc reference, I guess. But this is now with the aim shot. For whatever reason, the hasty shot, which seems like it should be worse, is actually better because it has double attacks. And then Hobgrot Slittas, didn't see that one coming, but that's the other thing is, like I said, if you only can use an all-out attack or something on one unit, you're never going to use it on your Hobgrot Slittas. But if you happen to have another source of it, or all of your Bolt Boys have been killed, and you've got extra CP, then sure, why not? Daughters, in addition to Bloodstalkers, now has Shadow Stalkers, so the teleporting unit, Canite Shadow Stalkers, and then Kennerai Heart Renders, the shooty version of the Harpies. Tzeentch has Flamers, so they've finally got a unit on the list now. Seraphon's got Skinks, so they've got a unit on the list. That's mostly because they're cheap, but, they do something, and that's why I put them on the cover of the thumbnail of this video, is because I just like that art. Nighthaunt, Craven Throw Guard, so they're on there now. These are the crossbows, if you will. So that's in addition to the Pyregeist, which are already in the top 17. KO's got Drecky Flint, which notably is the only hero that thus far in the conversation has crossed over the 3.00 threshold. Granted, he needs a +1 to hit to get it, but that's notable. And then Gits have MoonClan Shootas, again, if they get +1 to hit. All right, some notes about this. So the distribution was Order had 12 of the 20 new units, Chaos had 4, Death had 1, and Destruction had 3. None of these profiles make it past 4.0 output per 100 points, by the way. So even though they did pop over the 3.0 threshold, they did not get over into the doing significant damage, which means if you're contrasting them with the other units in the game that could be using a +1 to hit, they're still not cutting it, if you had to choose between the two. But some of these armies, like I've mentioned, didn't have an option. Like Tzeentch didn't have anything in the top. So Flamers are a perfectly great example of something you want to use. And they're very utilitous in that army for multiple reasons, which I'm not taking into account yet in this video, in this series. So the Skinks are actually the best of class as far as these 20 are concerned, sneaking past Bloodstalkers even with a +1. So Bloodstalkers were part of the 17. Then if both Skinks and Bloodstalkers have the option of getting +1, Skinks are actually more efficient. That doesn't mean they're the better option to choose, because it could be that with a +1, just not pound for pound, but just pure raw output, Bloodstalkers are still doing more. But in terms of efficiency, it's kind of interesting. And then Skinks are also better than Hearthguard at their base profile. But of course, Skinks only using +1 to hit. Next up are Jezzails, which pull ahead of Warp Volt Scourgers when they're using their base or a +1 to hit, just because Jezzails are cheaper, basically. I still like Scourgers, especially if you're going to Cavalry, which again, we didn't take into account with any of these equations. Calculations. In third place for the new units are Craven Throne Guard from Nighthaunt, pulling ahead of Arcanaut Company, which were in the original 17 when they're on their base profile. In short, while none of these are bad, they implicitly need to be buffed to be more efficient than any of the original 17 at their base stats. But it remains to be seen if some of those units have access to army buffs that push them ahead of many of the originals. So what do I mean? So these 20, it could very well be, and when I say it remains to be seen, I've done the math for everything already, but I haven't, let you guys see what's happening. But it could be that some of these units that weren't originally on the top 17, because of what's available in their army, or because of how reliable their buffs can be compared to some of those other units not having that many, that they'll actually shoot ahead once they get their decently reliable buffs off. Note, not a single one of these 20 new units is better than Warp Fire Throwers, even with a -1 to hit. Warp Fire Thrower was our original number 1 choice, and now it's moved down to number 4 if it's getting a +1. But a Warp Fire Thrower with a -1 to hit is the number 1 performing unit with a -1 to hit in the game, without any other buffs putting back on top of it. It just has a short range. And so not a single one of these with a +1 hit is as good as one of the original 17, or the best of the original 17, with the worst buff, or debuff, I guess. And most of them are worse than Namarti Reavers or Rattling Guns, also with a -1 to hit. So just keep that in mind. To rounding this point out, Sentinels are the point of like what got nerfed with a -1 to hit. We'll talk about it more in detail momentarily. But Sentinels and Warpvolt Scourgers are the only other 2 units from the original 17 that managed to still be above 3.0, even with a -1 to hit, but barely. All right. This is the chart that I was just referencing. This is the original 17, again, similar to the other one, at -1 versus what they were in base. So you'll see that after the first 5 entries, I underlined Warpvolt Scourgers, because everything below that, as you'll see in the P100 column, falls below the 3.0 threshold. So basically, only 5 of the original 17 that are great on their base end up being kind of worth talking about, I guess, once they get -1. That said, none of the 20 new ones with a -1 would be any better per se, because they were implicitly already below the 3.0 threshold, so they're just getting worse. But anyway, our top choices here are Warp Fire Throwers, which stayed at number 1 once they get the -1 to hit. Namarti Reavers, which went down from their old rank of 3, from their old rank of 3 to rank 2. Rattling Guns, which went down from 2 to 3. Sentinels, which stayed at 4th place. This is assuming the 18-inch range, or implicitly with a -1 to hit. Then now they can give themselves -1 to hit, so they've got the +6 inches. And then Warpvolt Scourgers, which, as we saw with +1 to hit, because they couldn't actually receive +1 to hit, were the last of the 17. But now they ended up actually going up 1 slot from what they were at base, because they take a -1 to hit better than most of the units do. So, they're a great covering fire unit. I guess that's kind of the thing here, is take a look at these top 5. These are great covering fire options, or, Lumineth using the extra range, because they're just not that severely impacted, all things considered, by a -1. And then we've got the rest of the units. You're welcome to read through this yourself. The percentage that they got reduced is kind of a mirror image of what we talked about before. I think you'll see, let's see, if we look at the delta, the most impacted negatively by any of these is a -4, and that's shared by Auric Hearthguard with a -1. They just got hit pretty hard, and at 33% reduction, so it swings the other way. And then Cruel Boys with hasty shots, the Bolt Boys, they fell a number of spots. And the most buffed here, again, from the base profiles, not from the +1, our Bloodstalkers went up by 5. So that's notable. Bloodstalkers actually do pretty decently with a -1 to hit as well. Okay, let's move on. So this is our concluding slide of stats. So what I did here is I just took the top 30 profiles, period, with everything we've looked at in the 2 videos cumulatively. So that would be including base profiles, and including +1 to hit and -1 to hit. I sorted all the data with all 3 of those different options, and just said, let's look at the top 30 things. And so we're going to go through each one of these in order as quickly as I can, but we're going to talk about them. So at number 1, Rattling Guns with a +1 to hit. They have an expected value average of 8 3/4 damage. That's just what a unit of 3 of them is going to do. So obviously, if you reinforce it, we're talking about double. And their output per 100 points is 5.83. If you'll remember, you can just look down to number 4 here. Warpfire Throwers base were our top choice before, which was, and because they can't get buffed here, this is their base profile. They are locked in at 5. So with a +1, we're still not even hitting 6. Just to know, there's nothing in the game that only with a +1 to hit breaks the 6.0 per 100 points efficiency threshold. Though certainly things will get there eventually. But right now, with +1, we're nowhere in the ballpark to getting up to the highest ranges of what we can achieve with lots of buffs. Reavers are the next with a +1 again, and Hearthguard or Hearthguard with a +1. So still seeing some pretty good output for these. Then number 4, and you'll see that anything I put in bold is because I think it should be taken into consideration as actually being higher than what it looks like for one reason or the other. And the reason here being that the Warpfire Thrower's base didn't need to have a +1 to hit. Like, it's just fighting really great above its weight class, if you will, even without having to blow CP on it or have some other source of +1 to hit. That said, it only has a 10-inch range. So, but it does have shoot in combat, and so did the Orc Hearthguard, by the way. So that's kind of cool. Arcanaut Company are coming in with a +1, are coming in at 5. And by the way, they have that built in their War Scroll if they're shooting something on an objective. So they're one of the best examples I can give you of something that isn't actually unreasonable to think that they might actually be receiving that range. So kind of like the Warpfire Throwers, it's almost like it's their base profile. Of course, you have to be shooting something on an objective, and if they can't get over there, that's rough. But I do think there's some weird build of like taking as many Artco as possible and just shooting the crap out of something, maybe finding a way to get a Purple Sun out and then having some extra rend. I think there could be a spam list there as long as you can get them around the board enough. But, that's a different conversation for another day. At number 6, we've got Rattling Guns at their base profile. So they were not only number 1, but they're number 6 in looking at all of the different things we're looking at thus far, which is saying something. And I put them in bold too because they have the same, they're technically a little bit higher. No, it looks like it's the same, but it's a rounding thing here. Our company with a +1 Arco are better than Rattling Guns technically, but because Rattling Guns are base and Arco are only getting that +1 if they're shooting something on an objective or using a command point, I would actually argue Rattling Guns are better, and they have better range too. Again, anything in bold is something I could argue for seeing that they actually belong higher on the list. Venari Sentinels with a +1. Again, assuming the 18-inch range, so they're not having a -1 here, are performing just a little bit. They're actually, I think they were literally the same as Rattling Guns, but because they needed a +1, I put them lower. Then Namarti Reaver's base, they're functioning at number 8, so nice. Which I could see an argument for them actually being better than Sentinels with a +1. Then Grunstock Thunderers with a +1. Let's see, Bolt Boys with Hasty Shots at +1. Hunters of Wanchis with Darts at +1. Of course, they're not doing a whole lot of damage, but like point for point, they're great. They're number 11 thus far with the 3 different situations we're looking at. Rotmire Creed is the highest non-Skaven Chaos unit, which is surprising. Granted, you can't reinforce them, so if you try to blow a +1 and you have no other source of it, you might be blowing that CP unnecessarily. But a place where you're not blowing it unnecessarily is on Vanguard Raptor Long Strikes with run and shoot, and then some really great hero sniping stuff, which is not being taken into account in this output. They go up quite a lot, especially against high saves on heroes once you get them up there. But we're not looking at it quite yet. Then we got Warpfire Thrower, like I mentioned before, with a -1 to hit, is still number 14 on this list, and is still, so it's at a debuff, right? And it's the highest performing debuff unit, as we mentioned before. Judicators with Bows with a +1 are next. And then looking at the second column there, Pyregeist, so the highest death performing unit with a +1, are sitting in 16th place. Venari Sentinels base, again 18-inch range, are sitting here at 17, and I would argue that they are probably higher because they don't need a +1. Blizzbarb Archers with a +1 are at 18. Skinks are our first unit that wasn't in the 17, the original 17 conversation from last time. Them being at a +1 gets them at 19th place. Bloodstalkers with a +1 at 20. Hearthguard, Orc Hearthguard base is at 21. And again, because it's a base profile, I think it might actually be doing better than it looks. Gossamed Archers with a +1 is at 22. Warplock Giselles at +1 is at 23. Warpvolt Scourger's base is at 24. Again, it's a base profile, so it's probably shooting up higher than it looks. Craven Throne Guard with a +1 is our next death unit in terms of shooting. Namarti Reavers with a -1 is in bold because they're getting a debuff, and yet they're still number 26 on the list. Arcanaut Company Base, so that's assuming they don't get a +1 to hit from shooting something on an objective, are still at 27 in terms of points efficiency. Bolt Boys Aimed, so finally we're looking at the aimed profile and not the hasty shot with a +1. It does give them more range, if I'm not mistaken. They are performing at 28. Rattling Gun with a -1 to hit, so covering fire, is still at number 29. And then lastly, of the top 30 is Judicators with crossbows now, not regular bows, but with a +1 to hit. Granted, those rules are about to change. Or maybe that's the long strikes with hurricanes. In any case, they didn't make it on the list. But I want just a reminder, not taking into account the Battle Tome stuff. In fact, I know it for 100% certain that it's the Vanguard Raptors that are changing. I don't expect anything in the Sacrosanct Battle Tome to be changing anytime soon because it's only got a short shelf life till July. Okay, so there's the chart. You've seen it, and we're going to close out with some thoughts here. So, while plus and -1 to hit is certainly a meaningful modifier, we still have much more to look at. So we are not seeing the whole picture, but now we do have a very reasonable baseline because we've looked at the actual baseline plus the the buff and debuff, the two modifiers that we know for a fact every unit has some amount of chance of coming across. So this is still a decent baseline to be looking at. Our second point here, all-out attack and covering fire can only be done once per turn. So unless your army has access to other ways to get these modifiers aren't scalable. Meaning, when we're talking about efficiency, we're often talking about how often you can reliably expect a unit to have a buff or a debuff. And if you have only one unit that you can pump everything into, or that could get like this debuff or whatever, spreading it out efficiency-wise isn't necessarily equating to the most, bang for your buck. Like I was saying with the Flamers versus talking about that Arco spam idea. That said, Arco can very reasonably get +1 to hit for across the whole army, so it does scale quite well because that's not a once per army ability. But anyway, I digress. And lastly, the margins of most of the top 30 are relatively tight, meaning the differences in output between the units, maybe not number 30 and number 1, but a lot of the stuff in the middle is pretty close. So if you have multiple options in your army, be flexible, right? So like, again, going back to the Zinch option, there's really no argument for anything but Flamers if you're talking about the best performers. But if you're talking about like Stormcast or Skaven or I guess Lumineth, not really, because we've only really seen one unit on the list, but maybe Cities or something, which had a number of things pop into the list once they got a +1 to hit. And then there's plenty of buffs that they have available that we haven't looked at yet. Then you don't really have to be too strict about, I need to take the absolute most efficient thing. Take what you like, take what has the right kind of synergies with your playstyle, because they all have slightly different ranges or other things that they're good at. So take those into consideration. But this is just kind of setting expectations here and getting a baseline once again. All right, so that's the video. I probably went over the time. I don't keep a track of that while I'm recording, but thank you guys for watching. Thanks for the interest in the first installment. Future installments will cover, maybe I'll go in depth with like Battle Tomes, multiple options, and like flesh out some of those, differences and what comes out on top. But I'd still like to keep this kind of generic. So maybe I'll look at like a kind of a sample of like 4 or 5 different armies of what kind of buffs you can expect to see, and maybe not focus so much on a comprehensive coverage of all the stats and output, but just focusing on what you could expect an army to have, and then maybe also looking at some of those armies that you had units that were in the top 30 or whatever, and then say, do they actually can they go much further than +1 to hit? Like it might be like Auric Hearthguard, I can almost promise you don't go much further than +1 to hit. means that they kind of get stuck there, which is a totally fine place to be, especially if the army doesn't have any other shooting. But there are some other armies that are like skyrocketing, like doubling their output. And by getting reasonable buffs off. So anyway, we'll talk about that in future videos. Let me know if you got let me know in the comments below if you've got any ideas for what you'd like to see. It kind of helps me kind of set my kind of plans for the future of what I'm going to do with these things. And let me know what you like about these videos. Again, if you got disagreements and stuff, let's keep it friendly, but like I'm trying to keep it as objective and stats oriented as possible, and hopefully I've explained away some of the maybe counterintuitive things that people maybe had problems with from the first video. So let me know if I succeeded in that mission. Anyway, thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it. I'll see you next time, and until then, Ryan out.